Hello, and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to do a kind of a campaign pitch me from me. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, it's pretty simple. On this podcast, with an S, podcast, we like to talk about games. Campaign Pitch Me is something we've done a couple of times on the podcast. It's just a loose pitch for a tabletop game campaign. I think we've done 2 or 3 of them by now. I think this is your first one, though, right?
Yes, this is my first one, and it is
popping your cherry. Let's do it. I'm so excited.
It is not as well thought out as yours are. I have basically a bunch of really what I think are really neat setting ideas, and I have a loose idea of what I want that to be in terms of the campaign, but it's more about the setting. I'm hoping to flesh out what that campaign actually could be.
Gotcha. Right. I super feel that. So, and also to be clear, is it like built for a system like Pathfinder, Starfinder?
Yes. Yeah. This should be a Pathfinder game. It would work in any fantasy setting, really. But like the idea is for Pathfinder,
elves and dwarves and all that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically the idea is in this kind of this is taking place in an alternate world. It might be a variation of the Rosaran idea we've talked about before, but it's essentially part and parcel of this is that there are like kind of like some of the variations of the core fantasy races are a little bit different. And this particular variation has that one subspecies of elf are like vaguely kind of Indian inspired, and their capital city is called Udana Mahal, and it's a floating city. It's a floating city that used to travel throughout kind of around the world, but has for a long time just kind of sat over this one area. And kind of the contours of this are that that the governance is a little bit weird. There's no kind of like formal government. There's like I think I forget the exact number, but there's like some number of merchant houses that control that are kind of like the ruling bodies,
like guilds or something.
Yeah, like guild, like think
Ravnica?
Or like merchant families, like kind of like merchant republics in CK2 or something like that.
Okay,
yeah. Kind of like.
I also think Eberron had something like this.
That would make sense. But essentially, the only kind of rules that hold are contracts that are made between various and sundry people, and there is one kind of compact that's kind of like the ruling. It kind of binds everybody together, and everybody's kind of like agrees to follow the rules by this. And the rules include that the arbitrating body is this guy called the Grand Arbiter, who everybody sends a bunch of like every house will send a large or a regiment of soldiers to like yearly to maintain to enforce the laws and enforce the contracts. And he's supposed to be a super neutral party. Part of this is that he's a human, and he serves for life, but because he's a human and everybody else is an elf, he turns over relatively rapidly in comparison. He's also not, it's not like he's coming from one of these families and he's got like ties that could potentially cause a conflict of interest or anything. And he sends out, and so he's in charge of this body that enforces all of these contracts. And like there are very few rules in the compact other than that you will abide by the compact. You will respect the arbiter's decision. If you decide not to, the forces of the arbiter will enforce those decisions upon you. And there's been relative peace for a while. There are also some neat little things that I thought up of in here. Like I think it's like 13 or 14 houses, and like 12 of them are elves, and like one of them's like so in another part of this world is that there are dwarves that are roughly Russian inspired. They're like one subrace of the dwarves, and they're slavers, and they have managed to they basically bought out a previously dying elf house, and managed to get themselves in. And then like there's also like where the city is hovering, it casts this big shadow, and underneath is kind of like this. Like, I call it like the Undercity, and it's just this like kind of slummy area where like a bunch of like like poor people live, of various sundry races. They're kind of like the repressed underclass in this setting, and then at some point, a bunch of them, or a handful of them, manage to get a basically a flying island and send a regiment to the Arbiter, and like they like by the rules of the compact they count, and then they close the loop. Well, that's all not like super important. It's just kind of like little pieces of flavor that I thought were neat. But it's essentially the idea is the party would be basically a group of kind of mercenaries working under the Arbiter, because the Arbiter has a duty that he needs to be handled outside of kind of the regular circumstances, because it's not directly dealing with city business, or I haven't quite figured. This is part of where it's like very loose, right? I haven't quite figured out what the problem is. I haven't quite figured out why he needs to hire a band of adventurers to handle it instead of doing it himself. But the idea is kind of like it's this urbanish campaign where you do a bunch of kind of like pure adventuring work, but like there's like this political bent to it because you have to bounce between the different families, and you're working for the Arbiter, but you're not officially recognized by him. And the end point that I have is that kind of the big reveal is that the Arbiter is actually, he's a human, but he's like a human wizard that has like granted himself immortality, and he's been like the Arbiter for like years and years and years. And this is kind of like against like this would be a big scandal if it was revealed, but he like runs things very well, so like maybe it's not so bad after all. So that's kind of like the very rough contours of what I have so far. Do you have any thoughts?
There's kind of like a conflict of like practicality versus principality in a way.
Yeah.
Okay, I feel that.
Yeah. So you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, so part of me feels like that like sounds like a film noir structure in a way, right? Where like, a bunch of adventurers get hired, but like things aren't super quite what they seem, and it gets like a little bit more complicated over time. I'm very fascinated by the idea, especially when it comes to group, to somebody like a quote unquote Grand Arbiter, of like the cooperation that happens between law enforcement and like criminality, or even like foreign interests, right? Like Sicario, the movie that I've referenced a couple of times, is functionally about this, right? Like the part of that movie is about saying, you know what, the chaos of taking down the drug cartels is not worth the fulfilling the principled request of let's take down the drug cartels, and they ultimately bring order to a lawless system in a way that is beneficial, right? Which is a pretty dark thing to say, but also at the end of the day, right, like if it is a system that works and does bring order to that lawlessness, right, like how much of that is is worthwhile, kind of a thing. And so I feel like that there is something of a question kind of along those lines, especially like, if the PCs are being led along a path of kind of power consolidation for or by the Grand Arbiter, where it becomes, where, if I'm a player character and I'm essentially stomping out dissidents of one variety or another, right? And even if those dissidents are bad or loathsome in some in some way or another, right? Like at what point are you willing to kind of sacrifice like each of these things? And I feel like, and the cool thing about that is you can almost kind of make it like a step system, where like the more integrated the PCs get into that question, the tougher and tougher the decisions become. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does.
So like maybe at first it's going out and doing some small scale, like kind of like whatever, right? But after the third or the fourth mission, and you're going and you're beating up a bunch of, whatever the equivalent of anarchist college students would be for this like elf society. You know what I mean? Like then that adds like a real question of the PCs, and I also think that like it should be a very real question. I don't think that this is a thing where like if the Arbiter ends up being lawful evil or whatever, like that would feel kind of cheap.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Right, like you want them to make the tough choice. No, I'm thinking that like just some ideas that are bouncing around in my head is something like troublemakers in the Undercity, right? Like it's a thing that he's like essentially maybe he's contracted contracted the party to be kind of like a secret police that deals with this group in the Undercity that's causing a lot of havoc, right? Like it's kind of like the like the terrorist freedom fighter kind of dynamic, and it's like they could easily be seen as either one because they're extremely like violent, but they are kind of like trying to get out from under this yoke of oppression, so it's kind of sympathetic, maybe something like that. I've got a couple other ingredients to throw into this stew that were like ideas I came up with that are more related to the city than directly related to the campaign, which is this idea that I call it's a tad dark, but I call them contract children. So in the United States law, kids can't be subject to contracts, right? Like any contract you sign at under 18 years of age, you can void if you choose to, until you turn 18. And my idea was that like there's a similar provision in the compact, right? Like this is a thing that all the families agreed to, because they all decided that they don't want to have like houses like preying on each other's children, trying to get them to sign like contracts to like catch each other in loops, because at some level they're all kids and they all want to see their families continue. So this is a kind of like it was meant to protect kind of like the children of the families. But what this has turned into is that like you get like street urchins because kids can't be held to these contracts. You get street urchins to go do like acts of like subterfuge and like corporate espionage, because they can't be held accountable to anything. Like they're not like, if you catch one of these street urchins spying on you and it's traced back to a family, you can't actually call them to a court because that kid can't be held to any of these contract things. And part of this was like, like maybe like, you send your disfavored sons or your bastards to do this kind of work. And, the best, like these contract children, like work really hard, like they're kind of feared, but they're all kids. And once they age out, they go either do something else or they become soldiers for the Arbiter, was kind of like part of that system there, right? Like that those kids are typically sent to the Arbiter to be the soldiers from that house, because they can't be used as kind of like these contract dodging children anymore, but they are highly trained and would be useful in their tithe to kind of the central authority, to keep order. So that was kind of another idea. Again, I'm not sure exactly how that would fit into this.
Do you think that there's any kind of like primogeniture or something like that for the merchants?
I would say that probably varies house to house. Is the way I thought about it. Like,
yeah, because something I've always found compelling is the idea that like primogeniture kind of encourages second or third children to like act out and be shitty and not care about things, because like they know that the firstborn is going to get everything,
right?
And so like that's how, like in medieval times, this is how you get like a lot of like knights errant and shit like that.
Yeah.
Because they are members of the nobility, but they don't own anything because it all went to their brother or whatever kind of thing.
Or they become a bishop, so you don't have to deal with that or whatever, right? Like
this
is all the CK2 stuff, right?
Is there a religion?
I haven't thought about it at all, actually. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so actually a bigger question might be, is there a caste system in the same way that like traditional Indian culture has a caste system?
So not per se. I was thinking of it more of kind of like there's like, the members of the aristocracy and everyone else. And like and just it's kind of like the idea was kind of like if you have means, right? Like even if you're not one of the families, but you're a wealthy person somehow, you probably didn't gain your wealth in this city, but you can like technically no one's barred from the city, but it's one of those things where like you don't like it's not like there's a staircase to the floating city. You have to figure out how to get up there. And so if you're living in the Undercity, you probably will never get up there unless you have some means to.
Well, what if that's the other way around? What if like the Undercity is like a state of exile or banishment? Do you know what I mean?
Huh.
Where like access to the city itself is restricted and protected or whatever, and like losing your access to the city, it throws you down into the Undercity. Do you know what I mean?
Huh. That's interesting. Okay, so I don't think the two need to be mutually exclusive, right? Like I think
Right.
I think there's space for it's like being banished to the Undercity is a thing that happens, but it's not like I do like kind of the idea that it's like a kind of like an open marketplace that like looks really kind of like bright and shiny on the top and for the well-to-do, but like literally the underbelly of the city, right? Like literally like sitting in the shadow of this monolith that never sees the sun because there's this giant structure parked over it, of kind of like the downtrodden, but like including like exiled people down there makes sense, I think. Like what are you thinking? Like like in one of these houses, there's like a shitty second son who's been exiled down there and is like.
So I was actually thinking about that as a version of like like insofar as this is a whole campaign, right?
Right.
The PCs are working for like the Grand Arbiter, but they are doing so with plausible deniability,
Right.
and part of that plausible deniability is about them getting exiled to the Undercity so that they can essentially do undercover work against like these whatever extremist revolutionaries or something kind of along those lines.
That makes sense.
I also sort of kind of like like a religious, like a cult is kind of the wrong word, but it's also the right word for I guess sort of what I'm proposing. But like a religious revolution that is that you know what I mean. That it's like insofar as this is a society built on kind of the market and these merchant houses and stuff like that, and you are someone who is denied even like the grace of like the sun on your face or whatever, right? I feel like that's a really easy thing for somebody to start praying to a god to fix, right?
Right.
It is a god who can cast that city down and bring it back down to earth kind of thing. And so you almost get kind of like that like repressive puritanical sort of sort of like feeling out of it, where there's a whole cult whose dedication is to bringing the Sky Fortress city to the ground because it is idolatrous or something kind of along those lines. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely I think that's neat. I think that could actually work well, and like yeah, actually I think that like there's also like I think room for like twists and turns. I think you were right in your initial assessment that this is supposed to like this is vaguely noirish. I've been reading a lot of Dresden Files, which is like noir fantasy but set in the modern age, so that's probably where I'm drawing some of this inspiration from. And so I think that like you could have like the head of this cult is actually like one of these like dispossessed or exiled like second sons or something, like some like somebody who used to be up there, and he really doesn't believe any of the things that he's spewing, but he knows he's charismatic and just kind of like is so mad that he just wants to watch the world burn or something like that. I think you could like, I feel like a lot like you I think the right way to play this would be something like you kind of like get a feel for like who your individual characters are, and like if you've got a character who's like this is all bullshit, revolution now, right? Like you show like you kind of like show one of these antagonists as being like the extreme version of that. It's like, oh, I am that, but for like the grace of God, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think that's like an effective narrative tool. I think there's a lot of space for that, right? Like the head of that cult could be any of those things. I was like this. I was also thinking that like campaign traits to go along with this kind of thing would be something like, one of your party members might be like a second son noble. One of them might be like a contract child that is just aged out. One of them might be just kind of like a wandering mercenary that like saw the job and thought the pay was good. Or something along these kinds of lines, just like little roles that you could kind of like build in to kind of like give it a really tight tie to like what's happening in the city. Because I think that like this works better when the characters are for the most part really involved in kind of the world and like care about like the fate of the city. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. I also sort of think that in a way, like if I was writing book one for this, I think book one would be very black and white, right? Because it's almost like a red herring at that point where like, you are going and being essentially deployed against a cult of Rovagug or something like that. And obviously you're not going to side with the fucking Rovagug cultists, right? But then like later down the line when you are being sent on a very similar mission, but then this one is a lot more empathetic, and like the leader is charismatic and not a crazy person, and they're kind of asking for or even demanding, very kind of like reasonable reforms. That sort of allows you to, I think that allows you to do two things. One, it allows somebody to kind of like do something bad, hypothetically, right? Like repressing this like cult of Rovagug or whatever, and then revisit that decision and be like, wow, I wasn't really thinking about it at the time, but I kind of judged these guys by the, by the cover. I judged this book by its cover sort of thing. Or at the same time, it also gives a justification for somebody who wants to stay on that path, right? Because they say, well, now this leader is like really charismatic and these reforms are reasonable, but as this movement picks up steam, it's going to end up just like that cult of Rovagug that we dealt with or whatever. And I feel like that sort of thing where it's like you introduce sort of like the world and the plight, let's say, in very black and white terms and then gray it up over time, like probably into like book 2 or book 3 or something kind of along those lines. Like that's really effective. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with you there. Yeah, I think that's actually a super effective idea. I like that a lot. I was trying to think of like how to kind of like tie, like, because like I said, like there's like very few laws of the land as they exist, right? Like because the merchant houses don't care, right? Like they don't care so long as their contracts with each other are respected, their contracts with the outside world are with respect to their neighbors are respected, and the only care they have about the Undercity is that it keep kind of like it's relatively tame, and that like if they need to go like pick up cheap labor, they can go get it from there.
Right.
And so like that gives the Arbiter a lot of kind of like a lot of leeway in terms of what he's asking the PCs to do.
Yeah, that's fair. That's really fair. I also sort of think that the decision point around the Arbiter has to happen somewhere in the middle of the story, right?
Yeah,
in a sort of in a sense, it's kind of like the decision surrounding how you guys wanted to treat Barzillai Thrune in Hell's Rebels, right? Where it's like you can't end the story on that note because it has to be like a real decision point with like real consequences. So it's something that happens in like book 3, book 4 stage. Right, which kind of creates a Y shape for the story structure to a certain extent, because on one hand you either have the players commit to the Grand Arbiter's sort of like schemes, and that is one trajectory, or rebel against them or whatever.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the trickiest part is probably like setting up that decision so that like it's not automatically repel against the Grand Arbiter, because I think that's like the kind of like usually portrayed as like the right decision in these types of storylines, right? That like but for all his good intentions, he's still like a bastard that's like doing something.
Okay. No, I super got this because I see where it is. It is in the relationship with these merchant houses to one another, which you know what I mean? Where like there's some conflict or some dispute about like the merchant houses, and it's getting bad and it's getting bloody, right? And the Grand Arbiter is able to exert his power essentially through the through the PCs, right, in order to resolve that, right, and stop the city from turning into like a bloodbath, trade war that becomes like a real war sort of thing. And so you can give the NPCs, you can give the PCs a clear, definable downside, right? If you toss the Grand Arbiter, right? Because even if you toss the Grand Arbiter and a new one pops up, do you know what I mean? Yeah. That will never solve the trust problem that is created by the NPCs outing him. And so you are definitionally in this place where it's kind of like the downside isn't even necessarily that the Grand Arbiter, or it's like the downside to removing the Grand Arbiter by spilling his secret, right? You tell the newspapers or whatever it is, kind of thing, about it, and like the public realizes that he's been, duping them for however long, including these merchant houses, right? You can't reestablish that system of governance, at least not immediately, which means that immediately after this takes place, all of these houses are going to like completely fuck on each other, and it's going to like, make the city awful.
Yeah. Okay. And then you keep him, and if you keep him installed, he keeps that in check. But so that's, I think, a really good consequence for the killing him aspect, or the dethroning him aspect. I think the kind of maybe the weakness there is that the opposite
it's not providing a positive case. That's fair.
Well, I don't know
if that's what you're going to say.
That wasn't exactly where I was going, but it's the opposite case, which is like leaving him in power doesn't have like necessarily like an immediate like bad effect. It's just kind of like an existential one, like you've let a monster stay on the throne for the sake of peace. But that's not like an actionable thing that comes to a head, right? Like that's it. That's kind of that's just kind of like one of these leads to a denouement, and the other one ends the campaign right there, kind of thing.
Which one? Sorry, which one ends the campaign?
The one where you like help like leave him in power, right? Unless your suggestion is that like the rest of that. Sorry, that was the local train. I'm sure you could hear that.
The train that you teased.
Yeah.
I'm very glad that the train was able to make an appearance.
Yeah,
I really wanted that Chekhov's gun to pay off.
But yeah, that like so let's say they hit this decision point. They're either going to upend if they upend the Arbiter, then the back half of the campaign is them resolving kind of like this massive conflict that they've effectively caused, correct?
Yeah. Okay, and so, but if they leave the Arbiter in power, what does the rest of the campaign look like? Is that the question?
Yeah.
See, I feel like in both cases, the danger always has to be that the city, that whatever keeps the city aloft falls. And that's the coolest part.
Yeah.
No, do you know what I mean? Like, right. If there is an apocalyptic, like in a lot of superhero movies, this is what it always comes down to, right? Like in Guardians of the Galaxy, the apocalypse is, Ronan with the power gem destroying the Nova Corps planet or whatever. Or in 2, it's that like this like flower is going to bulb up and take over Atlanta or whatever. Fucking whatever.
Yeah. Or like in Avengers: Age of Ultron, where there's a floating city.
Yeah, exactly. But like, so the thing has to be that I feel like in either case, the thing has to be the danger is that whatever keeps the city aloft is going to fail, and the city is going to plummet, and everyone is going to die in that, like
No,
in that apocalypse scenario. That's just, but like, I don't know, maybe that's, part of me says that is unreasonable because it can never come true.
Right,
You know
I
what I
see what
mean?
you're
It's the
saying,
kind
yeah.
of thing where it's like, listen, in Man of Steel, Zod can't ever successfully terraform the Earth, because if he does, the movie ends. You know what I mean? So there really
Right.
isn't like, a real set of snakes, because the villain can never actually accomplish it unless you wanted to do something crazy like, the end of book 5 is that the villain's plane goes off and the city plummets, and then it's like a post-apocalypse or something like that.
No, I mean that could be like a second. Like, I think I'm okay.
Like
with,
a second campaign, actually.
or like like that. The idea is that the PCs might actually fail at that, right? Like that you have contingency
okay.
set up so that might happen. Which is interesting for like, theoretically this is part of a fictional world that I want to build. So it's like, oh, well, the timeline splits right here, and you have either, your post City Fall or your whatever.
I feel like, I mean, I feel like that is a natural piece of the,
Yeah.
like that's kind of how you wanna make it, and how you wanna kind
Oh
of
no,
build it
absolutely,
out.
yeah.
Definitely.
Absolutely. This is like a video game that has multiple endings. In the sequel, there's one of them is a canon ending, right? Like, I like it can definitely work. I just, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the city has to have a real danger of falling. Like, it can't not happen. I don't think you prescribe. I think that's actually the like end point of the campaign, right? Like either the the last thing that happens in the campaign is the city falls, the city stays afloat, and if it falls, like, bad ending, I guess, right? Like I think that's an okay.
I mean, maybe
ending
there's a version of things where the PCs want the city to fall. Like
Mm.
maybe that's like the coda to this whole thing with like the noble houses fighting or whatever. It just generates so much strife and anxiety that the only thing that the PCs can do is blow it all up.
Right.
You know what I mean?
So
Which would be kind of like cool and ironic, hypothetically speaking, if they start the campaign by, dealing with like a cult of Rovagug kind of like XPs, right? Who hypothetically want to, Rovagug is the god of destruction. He wants to destroy everything, sort of thing. So like a version of things where like they come around to it, and they're like, oh yeah, no, this is too fucked up. We need to destroy this.
yeah, I think again that has to, like, the players have to make that choice, right? Like both choices are, the choice about the Arbiter is like step one of this, and then like the city falling is like another step of this.
Yeah.
Although I do think that like, so the unbalanced thing is that like I think that there's still a good story where like the PCs want the city to stay afloat and they fail at that somehow, right? Like whatever set of factors needs to go, they just screw it up.
Yeah.
And it falls anyway. I think that's a legitimate conclusion. I don't think that the version of things where the PCs want the city to fall and they fail at that and it stays up is a satisfying conclusion to the story.
Oh, I mean, I think that could be satisfying, especially if you frame it like, okay, let's say hypothetically they want the city to fall, but they are being stopped by, so imagine this. Imagine you spend the first 3 books not just setting up like bad guys in like the moral quandary or whatever, but also setting up a lot of supporting characters, other people who work with the Arbiter or on his behalf, who are willing to be his kind of like mouthpiece, right? And it is these people that they are now in direct conflict by, by like suggesting or saying that the city needs to be destroyed, essentially, in order to, in order to solve the problem, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? And like, I feel like there's a lot of like weight or like stakes to that.
Yeah, can you? I'm not quite following you. Can you say that again?
So what I mean to say is like, book 4 rolls around, and all of a sudden you find out that so book 4 rolls around, all of a sudden the PCs have to make a decision, and then they say, you know what, the Arbiter is he may not be the most true definition of power hungry, but he is lying to the people, and he is propped up by this lie, and the people deserve the truth, and so they out the Grand Arbiter, and it kind of completely delegitimizes him inside of like a day, right? Or something like that. Like, and he's deposed or he's ignored or whatever. And then book 5 is dealing with the fallout among these noble houses, or not these noble houses, these merchant houses, who are now completely unrestrained from tearing each other's throats out, right? And then the end of book 5 confirms the fact that, you know what, there is just no salvaging this situation. And so the PCs, you know, maybe they team up with some villain from earlier or whatever, because they're like, okay, no, your original plan to blow up the city is like actually a good plan. It's the only thing that we can like possibly do. And it includes things like, we're going to evacuate the Undercity so that none of these people who are, you know, kind of like defenseless get hurt, and, you know, like kind of like all of these other sorts of things. But the people that they are now fighting, right, are the remnants of the it's not even the noble houses necessarily, right? But it is the remnants of like the Arbiter's office and his like, you know, like his Arbiter team or whatever. And so like, I feel like that reversal is like interesting and complex enough that it kind of like carries it through.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's a version of this where like I think one, you want that villain to kind of float. Like, you don't necessarily want to set exactly who it is, because I can see a version of this where the villain is or like the people who want the city to fall are this cult. They're like this kind of like, you know, off-brand house that I was talking about that kind of like inserted themselves into the mix via technicality, and they're still kind of like they were under city citizens in the first place. They just want to see the whole thing burn. I think there's a version of it where it is the Grand Arbiter that you've exposed, right? He's like, I'm going to burn this all down. And I think that you want to pick kind of like who out of those based on kind of like the demeanor of your party. Because like I kind of want like this is again, I apologize, this is so rough, but like I want kind of like part of this is to be like interactions with the different houses. And so like if you're buddying up to like this kind of like, you know, common man's house, and then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, we're gonna burn it all down. We're gonna evacuate the Undercity, and then it's going to fall, and by consequence, so actually this works. So my idea, like I haven't quite figured out what holds up the houses in the city. So I was not clear about this. So the house, like there's the city, and then all the houses are like have their own private flying islands, right? So they're all separate, right? And so my idea was that all of like kind of like the normal houses are and the city are held up by some magical force, maybe like an Jin or something like that. But this kind of like off-brand, like this kind of like weird self-insert house is flying by a mechanical means, right? Like they like steampunked something together, and they've got this house flying, and technically they count as a flying house. And so by the rules of the compact, the city must recognize them as a house, and everybody kind of grouses about it for a little while. And so like if they're the villains, right? Like whatever is going to knock down the city also causes the other like 12 merchant houses to fall out of the sky too, because you're basically disbanding whatever magic is keeping it right, afloat. Yeah. And then this other house is fine with it. It's like we're fine, right? Like we're flying by a mechanical means, so we don't have to worry about us falling. And when this happens, there will be one house left, and it will be us. And the prosperity will be ours, or something like, pick your kind of like rationalization based on the part. Like this is, I think that's really important, is that you want this to be flexible enough that your kind of like consequences fits your party well, right? Like, if you've got a bunch of like do-gooders, turns out that the people that you've buddied up to are actually assholes this entire time, that they're just power hungry on their own, they've been using you. If they're kind of like if they're kind of like practical people that have been trying to do the good thing, they realize, or they're trying to like maintain like order in the city, that there's some other thing that's like like if everything goes to its conclusion, there'll be order, but it'll be of the kind of like iron-fisted totalitarian version that you can't abide, or something like that, right? You want this to resonate with your party, so you need to base it on how they feel. about things.
I also think that makes sense when it comes to like the villain or whatever, right? Like if they want to go break a villain out of jail that they locked up, it should be, in a certain sense, it kind of sounds like it should be one that they choose, where over the course of the first couple of books, they're locking up, they're going on these adventures, and they're locking up, all of these people, and then they get to go back and choose one or more, to like be on their new team when they decide they want to like turn on things or whatever, right? Like I feel like that's like a compelling choice that the players really get to kind of make.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I'm also envisioning a version of this where like, like essentially like if you draw like this Punnett square, for lack of a better term, of like, arbiter, no arbiter, city falls, city stays afloat, like no arbiter, city stays afloat. Like maybe a version of this is that, they expose the arbiter, but then they find out like after the fact, it turns out that he's the one that's keeping everything afloat. Like he's like this, like immortal mage. And the magic that would have kept the city afloat like ran out a long time ago, but he basically, because he enjoyed his position of influence, he's been keeping the city afloat, and either he refuses to maintain it, or like the other, or like he wants to, he doesn't care and he wants to still maintain it because he's fundamentally a decent person. But like, the merchant houses are calling for his head because he's deceived them for so long, and they won't listen to you, that he's actually holding everything afloat or whatever. So I think this is all, I think that this variability is super important. How would you suggest going about writing this? Because I'm kind of like, I could write like, if not that I'm planning on actually committing this to paper, but like if I wanted to write this so that somebody else could run it, how would you would you just like write like 3 versions of book 4 or whatever? How would you handle that?
God, that is a really interesting question. See, the funny thing is that like when you are writing your own campaign, you have a lot of flexibility to make those decisions on the fly, because like I hypothetically, there is a version of Hell's Rebels, right, where you guys followed through on the war with Bars Lythrune. Book 4 was taking the city back, right, and then book 5 and book 6 were setting up your new government and doing all of this stuff with like Chelayax and everything like that. But we kind of ended up in this position where, all of that hypothetical storytelling never really had to happen. And I'm sure I would have reused a lot of similar plot points. Like obviously reconciling the relationship between Chelayax and Ravenel is like a fundamental thing to the story, right? And so like both versions of that include a plot with rhino terrorists or whatever, right? In fact, that whole bit was stuff that I was adapting out of the 6th book, I believe, which was built on the which was like built on a railroad narrative, right? Like where there wasn't that kind of where that wasn't that kind of a choice. So in some spots, I think that there would be overlap, right? And you would be able to say, oh well, in order to either uphold the wards that are keeping the city afloat or destroy the wards that are keeping the city afloat, they need to go to the ancient Magister's archive where the original ritual is locked away in a library or whatever. And so like that, that set of encounters could be, that set of encounters could be like shared across kind of no matter what. But I definitely do think that you needed it to make your own, you kind of need to like make your own story, because otherwise you fall into that trap of like, I mean, I think people are wrong who do this, by the way, but like where people say that because the Telltale Walking Dead game, there was a lot of stuff that you repeated no matter which side of the decision you made happens, right? That kind of like removes some of the choice about it or whatever. And I think that that's wrong, but I do think that players, feel that way about stuff, and there's not much you can do.
Yeah, I think part of that is the strength of this medium, right? Like that you can kind of do what you want without having to like worry about replayability or anything.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think part of this answer might just be that like pre-written adventure paths can't handle this kind of variation, and so you kind of have to spin it yourself. And like if you wanted to write this up into like an adventure, like it'd have to be like either like loose kind of like story beats without like connective tissue, or like or like it would have to be like an inordinate amount of work, which like I could see that being an interesting product, right? Where like there's like 1 book 1, 2 book 2s, 4 book 3s, like just like doubling each one, and like like I'm an insane person that has written like 47 books and you'll use 6 of them, which I think could be neat. But I also don't think that's a thing that anybody would in their right mind do.
I also think to a certain extent, I mean, it's a little tough to do this because like levels aren't very modular, but I also think that there's a certain amount of like, I almost sort of like an idea where the first, let's say in my head, the decision about the Arbiter comes at the end of book 4, which is completely arbitrary, but it essentially sets up that the first 4 books are dealing with you working for the Grand Arbiter in some variety or another. And I almost kind of like the idea that like, outside of sort of like an early tutorial, right? So like, let's say defeating the cult of Rovagug or whatever is kind of like the early tutorial. The story itself is actually kind of a la carte and episodic and can go in any order that you want. Like, Here are the different things that I need to get accomplished, and it doesn't matter what order you accomplish them in. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And like,
because I like choices like that because it lets the party, first of all, it lets the party prioritize, which is something that I think is very compelling for players, right? Like this is something that happened in book 2 of Hell's Rebels, where like there were 3 different goals you needed to accomplish, and they were all on a time frame, so you needed to prioritize which ones you were going to do like first. And I think that that's like a strong impetus for players, right? When you have a choice between a bunch of different plot threads and you have to make a decision about which one goes, which one is the number one most important sort of thing. And maybe that leaves plot threads that aren't mined. Like maybe, maybe there are 8 different threads, but only 6 of them get completed or something kind of along those lines before, the PCs get all of the pieces to the conspiracy puzzle or whatever.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that kind of like leads to this situation where like essentially I think what you want to do is you want to like kind of set these threads up and like kind of let them hang, and then like only write out the ones that they end up biting on. Which it's interesting, right? Like, so I don't know, this is like a weird problem, but like I feel like if like at the end of the campaign, the players can say like, well, what would have happened if we followed up on plot thread X? You're like, well, you would have done the same thing, but it would have gone somewhere else. It's kind of like a disappointing answer. But I think that's kind of got to be like this is like the tabletop version of this Walking Dead thing, right? Like it's like I would have just like rearranged the facts so that you would have all like you would have figured it out and would have been through a different avenue, but it would have been like a lot of the same thing.
Also, I think it kind of like changes the context in which some of these things get accomplished, right? Like teaming up with Rovagug cultists is different than teaming up with, agitated magical university students or something kind of along those lines.
Right.
And so even if you kind of like end up at the same kind of like decision point, and that is a real choice you get to make about it or whatever, how you got there is different. And I think that matters.
I think you're right. Again, it's all about controlling the contours. It's just kind of like this weird problem where like the players are going to be curious and you need to have some answer for them.
I also feel like it allows the players to kind of explore the pieces of the world that they find most interesting and most compelling. Where and sometimes like doing it the opposite way, where like things are more linear and less episodic, like kind of forces players to care about things that they don't care about in a way. Like I kind of ran into this problem in Hell's Rebels with Rikax, right? Who I built in a whole bunch of Rahadum stuff because of what I just assumed, because he's like Rahadumi, but he never really latched on to any of those things. So they're all important and integral to the story, but like also nobody in the party cares about them in the
Right.
same way that you would expect them to. So having these things be a little bit more plug and play allows the players to kind of like follow their, to follow their bliss.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Gwyneth Paltrow would say.
Is that a Gwyneth Paltrowism?
I have no idea. She just is that kind of person who would say something like kitschy and like it belongs on a poster in an HR department, I guess.
I could believe that.
I feel like there should be a lot of I feel like there should be like a lot of like kind of textured pieces to this, in the sense of like, I keep going back to this Rovago cult, but I feel like there should be some other, factions, so to speak, sort of like like moving around and working within the city. Did you have any other thoughts about what some of those factions might look like?
I mean, so primarily it's like the 12, 13, 14 merchant houses, right? Like they all have their own kind of, they all have their own motivations, and like, they have like these shady ass, like, it's like essentially like, a city run by what are effectively mob families. So like they're all going to have like these aspects to them, right? Like, so there was that was my primary thing. I didn't like the Undercity. I kind of like was imagining as kind of like a unitary force, as like another house in a way. But I think you're right. I think that there need to be other forces within like that are kind of like at play trying to do these kinds of things. But like I hadn't really thought about it. I like I said, I thought that the biggest factions always were supposed to be the merchant houses, trying to play against each other. And
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Do they all have like a monopoly on a certain like trade or something like that? Like, is there like a weapons producing merchant house, and they're militaristic or whatever, versus an artistic merchant house, which is more bohemian?
Yeah, so I hadn't mapped out what they would be, but the idea would be that they're all individually in control of like certain corners of the market, right? With like the Dwarven House being the one that was like the one that dealt in like human capital, right? Like because they are not they're slavers.
They're the slavers.
Yeah. So that was the only one that I had kind of nailed down for them, and like something with like the Undercity House being like dealing in like kind of like mechanical technology, since they managed to get their island up and floating without magic or whatever. But yeah, the idea was that like they all had specializations and they all dealt in like I was thinking like kind of like things that were kind of like stuffy and maybe not particularly relevant to the story, right? Like one house dealt in like mine, raw resources. Another one dealt in like textiles, and maybe you had a couple of like weird ones, like one that deals in like I don't know, something like something a little bit more esoteric, like musical instruments or something like that. I wasn't quite sure, and I haven't nailed those down, but that was
gotcha.
That was the idea.
No, that definitely makes sense. I sort of feel
Excuse
that.
me.
What is the state of like druidic or like primal magic, all of that kind of stuff, like wildernessy kind of stuff?
So I've got two thoughts. I had two thoughts on that. One was that it was either the purview of like one of the houses, right? Like that was their thing, that, or that it was kind of like a basically non-existent, right? Like the land beneath the city is blighted of all suns. So like there's not like not a lot grows down there, and it's like heavily urbanized, and like they're elves. So like I feel like there's like some aspect of that there. But I didn't think it was going to be like, so it's there in that like I had imagined that the city was held aloft by some sort of like air magic, right? Like that's kind of like a fundamental thing. That there's like, that they're like, restrained Jinn. Maybe that's maybe that's like what one of the houses does, right? It's like a binder of air spirits to like get these like I imagine part and parcel of this was like airships that like kind of like ferry these things to and from the city,
That's how airships work in Eberron. They have like elementals bound.
Yeah.
So that would make a certain amount of sense.
Yeah. And so like it's definitely a thing that's around, but I don't know if it's anything that's like super maybe that's actually an interesting idea where like, you know, one of the there's the houses kind of there's like a couple of the houses are all competing on like different ways of doing this. Like there's some ships that are driven by these elementals. There's some that are driven by like some pure arcane magical means, right? Like I don't know, like permanent wind spells. And there's some that are like mechanical airships, which I think would be like a nice balance that like rounds out like three like the house specialties are like arcane magic, primal magic, and like mechanics, and like that's not all they do, but it is a point. It's like a thing that drives conflict between those three particular houses. Like,
right.
Like the way I wanted to set up like these monopolies, and this is why I didn't spend a ton of time putting it together, was I wanted them to be like not necessarily things that had like a huge impact on like what the players did, but there were things where like you could see where like the edges of what they did overlapped with each other, and that caused a lot of conflict, right? Like if everybody's super monopolistic and like has their own tower that doesn't interfere with anybody else, there's no like conflict driving between the houses, right? Because like everybody's happy to kind of stay in their lane, but you want like you want like the textile people and like the like the I don't know, like the what else could work in this, like the textile people provide sales to like the mechanical house to push their ships, but the other two houses don't need them, or like the other two.
No, yeah, I mean that kind of thing I feel like happens, what is it, vertical integration? No, it's horizontal integration,
Yeah.
right? Like when you horizontally integrate, you still have to deal with like other markets or whatever.
Right, but the idea is that they would all be kind of like broad enough that you could see where they would conflict with each other.
Yeah.
And they'd be pushing each other out, right? Like, easiest one is like, like the guys who do stone and the guys who do wood, both are like competing over like who builds like the houses out of what, right? Like, that kind of thing. I don't know if that particular conflict would work exactly well here, but that's kind of like the driving idea behind this conflict in the clouds, as it were.
Do you think that the entire campaign is going to take place inside of this one city setting, or is there going to be any like, the PCs go to Kyonin or go to Chelayax, or sort of like they go on trips outside of the city anywhere?
I think that this one stays inside the city. I think that's very much in keeping with kind of like the noir theme. Like, I also imagine this kind of floating city to be fairly massive, right? So like, if you wanted to do like a dungeon delve, it would not be like out of the question for like to be like an abandoned sewer system that has something in it, or right, like something in the bedrock that's been sealed away for a number of years and has like a bunch of nasties down inside of it. But I definitely wanted to kind of like. Like the kind of like the it's a dirty city, but it's my city type of thing. So like I always feel like like in like these city adventures, there's always like, and then they went outside for a book because we needed to do it, and that always feels kind of like chintzy to me. Not that I thought that the way you handled it in Hell's Rebels was bad.
This is some bullshit, you guys. You heard it here first. Mango hates me. No, yeah, I mean, I feel like I think it's important to kind of like vary the vary like the locale for people. But if the city is big enough to kind of support it, that's that's obviously fine.
Yeah. This is one of those things where like we've talked about this before, but like characters that specialize in certain terrains, like I think those things are neat, but like you have to have the right campaign for it, and it's I think it's just it's a giant trap. Like Rangers are a giant trap. It's kind of like the lesson that I take from that kind of thing.
Are there any like custom rules or rule sets like diplomacy or anything like that you feel like you would need to add in order to keep this game on its rocker?
I think I might need to do something like we talked about in previous episodes with like the tagging system for diplomacy, but I think there's a train again. But I think that how do I want to put this? That's like a weakness with the Pathfinder system in general, is that the kind of speaking rules aren't great for anything like beyond kind of like very simplistic interactions. Like
Gotcha.
We've talked about this a lot before, but I think that the Pathfinder kind of like speech rules are something that are desperately in need of like expansion. But that's the way it is. Otherwise, just like custom stuff, like custom stuff around like campaign traits, custom stuff around how like these different races act, right? Like you don't get the same set of traits out of these elves as you do other types of elves. Like I said, this was like part of like a grand vision for a campaign world, which would already have those kind of like well established, right? Like they're like 5e has this concept of like sub races. And I think 2e has some of it too. I think they actually added it in an update, if I'm remembering correctly, of like this sub race idea. So like that, like you could do a bunch, like you can put in a bunch of stuff for the races and the traits such that you have a bunch of that flavor built in that way, but that would be a larger scale thing.
Well, I think that's a pretty complete, discussion of a pitch. I would very much like to play in this game, except I just spoiled it all for myself.
Yeah.
Fuck. Yeah. As did everybody who listened to the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, but that's,
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, we do this to ourselves, right? Like every time we talk about like one of these campaigns, it's like, this sounds really great, but I know the ending now, right? Like,
yeah.
Although I think I've forgotten what the big twist of the Caravan campaign is, so maybe I could do that now.
Oh God, what was the big twist of the Caravan campaign?
You forgot.
I remember it was very twisty. I remember it was like,
yeah,
but I don't remember what it was.
I think it's that when you like get to like the Promised Land, it's already like screwed. Like they've.
Oh yeah, like Mad Max Fury Road.
Yeah. But yeah. That was the campaign pitch. Moving into our weeks, I think I'm going to take priority on this one, if you don't mind.
Go nuts.
Because I wanted to talk.
Tell me all about it.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Game Awards. Did you watch the Game Awards?
I did not watch the Game Awards.
I sat down and I watched the Game Awards, and I had a couple different thoughts.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. No. So somebody online pointed this out. Is that like the fundamental lie of the Game Awards is that anybody is watching it for the awards. They're watching it for the premieres and the trailers, and like the awards themselves are the filler, with the exception of maybe
okay.
theater,
Yeah.
Which is kind of unfortunate, but I think the way that like gamers are, you couldn't. I don't like the Oscars are falling off in viewership, right? Like, I don't think this works any other way. The first thing I want to say is I don't know why half of these presenters are just like normal movie stars or directors, or whatever. Like they had like Jonah Hill present an award. They had like a Muppet, Pepe the Prawn, present an award with Ninja, and
Chef Keely, what are you doing? That's amazing.
And they had like I get like the Russo brothers, right? Like this makes sense. It's like vaguely nerd adjacent. They had like, it's like every time like it's clear that they're like, I am doing a thing because I have been asked to, and not because I understand or like these video game things. Like I think the funniest one to me was probably like of these like weird people is like it's the front man for like System of a Down or Panic at the Disco. I forget which band he was the front man for, because I don't listen to a lot of that type of music. Not that I have anything against it, but he's like, he like made this kind of like sarcastic quip. He's like, I was supposed to write something, but they wrote it for me. He's like, as a musician, huh? And like he like goes to his little spiel. It's like, wow, way to fucking like,
pull back the veil.
Yeah. Somebody actually posted a video. There's like apparently like facing the stage is like this giant LCD screen that would like flash like wrap it up if they were going too long.
I saw that because people posted it about the most controversial winner is Esports Player of the Year, what was the guy's name? Sonic Fox.
Sonic
or
Fox.
something like
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Yeah, who is a gay black furry and called out the Republican Party in his winner's speech. And so on Twitter, people were posting the wrap it up sign about how the Game Awards hated that he just like wouldn't shut, like he wouldn't shut the hell up or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's some other stuff about him too, like stuff like the stuff I've seen is like maybe he's actually like has promoted bestiality in the past. I don't know if any of that's true or not. And he's a weird dude. I don't like wish him any ill will unless
I have no understanding of him whatsoever, so
Yeah.
I can't even comment.
Yeah, he's a dude. He had some pretty impressive plays earlier in the year. Like the big moment he had was in I think it was the DBZ finals at Evo. He like it got like it's it was like a best of something, I forget what. I think somebody got the recent. I forget exactly what it was, but like the first set he played on one side, and then like whatever the situation was, he requested a side change, and he had like there was some controversy about whether or not he was allowed to do that or not. And he did switch sides, and he switched sides and then like wiped the floor with the guy. And so like the consensus is that like maybe that was some marginal advantage, but he probably just kind of like it's called like downloading like getting the download or whatever. He read his opponent well enough to pull it off at the end because he reverse swept it after that. But that was a really hype moment, and he's a really good player regardless of whatever else is up with him.
Yeah, yeah.
But other highlights I thought were, or the other big highlight for me was they had Chris Judge and Sonny, I forget his last name, present an award. They're the voice of Atreus and Kratos, and so it's so they were like, and the winner is, and then the kid like held it and like wouldn't open it for like 20 seconds, and he's like after a couple seconds he's like, boy, read the award, and it's like, oh, I thought it was cheesy, but I thought it was good. But otherwise, like the biggest surprise, like I was surprised that God of War won it over Red Dead Redemption 2. I don't think that's wrong. I actually agree with that sentiment. I think God of War was a better game than Red Dead Redemption, but I just didn't think that they would think that.
I was really interested by that because Sony Santa Monica is like, it's just an interesting studio, and you never hear good things coming out of it. And now they have a best game of the year award, which is just kind of crazy. Yeah.
Okay, so the other big thing, this is kind of like the big point I wanted to make about it, was so at the beginning, like Jeff Keighley has said, like I've got this moment that's going to come out in the show. I've been trying to make it happen for 5 years, and it's finally happened. I'm super excited for this, right? And this big moment is towards the beginning of the show. He gets Reggie Fils-Aimé, Phil Spencer, and I forget the Sony executive's name, but he gets all the three executives from the big three out on the stage together to introduce the show, and you can tell that like he's Jeff Keighley's keeping his composure, but you can tell that this is like a thing that means a lot to him, right? Like that, that he's got the entire industry out here to celebrate it. That like, and it's a cheesy advertising show, but it is a realish award show at this point. And so like, my kind of takeaway after that is like, people give Jeff Keighley a lot of shit for like the Doritos Pope thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the way history should remember it is like not that like Jeff Keighley is a sellout. It's that Jeff Keighley is a man who believed in the Game Awards so hard that he was willing to sell himself on the street to make sure it happened, right? Like, like it's not like the dirty whore. It's the dirty whore that's providing for his kid because he believes in it so much, right? Like, and I hope that history remembers him that way because he's like, you can criticize the Game Awards, and I think it has a lot of criticisms that you could level at it. But he definitely cares about the industry, and he definitely cared about making this thing real to lend legitimacy to the industry, and I have to applaud him for that. And so that was kind of my big overarching takeaway from it is that like, for all its cheesiness and like corporatism, it's still like a legitimate celebration of the kind of like gamer community, for lack of a better term.
I remember a couple of years ago the extra credits guys put out a video about the lack of essentially the Game Awards, right? How and they talked specifically about how the presence of the Oscars creates a secondary kind of like subsistence market for different kinds of movies, because what it allows you to do is, if you are, you know, if you're making like a prestige picture or whatever, winning Best Picture turns that prestige movie into a movie that you can then like market as a Best Picture winner, right? And it gets you a bunch of like fame and acclaim and all this other kind of stuff, and how a similar system could be really helpful for video games, right? Where you kind of have a secondary market that allows you to make games and market them differently than just, this is the must-play blockbuster game of the year sort of thing, in order to get that, I don't know, in order to get that like good stuff. You to find the moonlight of video games, you sort of need to have a you sort of need to have a version of the Oscars, and that the Game Awards is hypothetically going to become that, even if it isn't necessarily at this moment. I don't know how true that is or how great that is. I mean, from like the film side of things, people complain about that aspect of.
So
do you know what I mean? People complain constantly about that aspect of the Oscars, because, like, you know, The Dark Knight doesn't win in 2008 or whatever, or like Black Panther isn't going to win this year or whatever it is.
So I've got to counter this, because I don't think that's quite right. I think so. This is the thing I've been thinking about a little while, just because of some like terms things, right? Like, games comes out of an enthusiast market, right? Like you know, like 10 years ago, gamer was like not only the sole participant, but it was also like the enthusiast, if this makes sense, right? Like, this is a thing that comes up sometimes when people talk about like, well, anybody who plays games is a gamer, and it's like, yes but no, because like gamer was the enthusiast term because there weren't casual gamers a while ago, and so like the language around that is kind of confusing, and maybe we should come up with a different label. Do you follow me so far with that?
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
And so like I think that like the like God of War and Red Dead Redemption and like maybe even Spider-Man are like these prestige games, right? Like, our blockbusters are like the Call of Duties and the FIFAs, right? Those are the ones that like don't get acknowledgement and any like don't get anything but like the most cursory of acknowledgement at this award show. And I think that's because you know, while the cinephiles drive the kind of like the prestige picture kind of aspect of it, they're not kind of like as big a part of the audience as like, or as part of like the general audience as I think gamers are of like the game consuming audience, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like, or maybe it's just kind of like a matter of exposure, right? Like, only enthusiasts care about like the Game Awards, so like they're already playing, and there's enough of them that they drive like God of War and Red Dead Redemption are AAA games that are going to sell like gangbusters, right? But they are kind of like these passion project siren songs, as opposed to like your Call of Duties. And so I think that the Game Awards doesn't need to exist in order for those to come out. But I do think it works well as like a community touchstone type thing. And I think that's kind of like what the show is aimed at, and I think that's like kind of maybe what like it has been aimed at so far, is like the idea of like kind of like the games enthusiast community as something more than just kind of like a general grouping, like moviegoers are everybody, right? Like and increasingly people who play games are everybody, but games enthusiasts I think are a large but definitely identifiable group, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, I mean, the only winners of the Game Awards have all been like big titles, right? Dragon Age Inquisition, The Witcher 3, Overwatch, Breath of the Wild, God of War are the 5 winners since the inception of the Game Awards in 2014. But I definitely feel I definitely feel what you're putting down. I think that makes like a lot of that makes a lot of sense. Boy, 2014 was a crazy year for the Game Awards. I forgot how many. Hearthstone came out as a mobile game that year and won Mobile Game of the Year. Far Cry 4 and Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor were both of that year. Grand Theft Auto 5. Wow. Anyway.
You know what? That's like, you know, like if there was ever a Game of the Year snub, it's that Fortnite didn't win it this year. It won it. Some other outlet gave Fortnite Game of the Year. But like, you know, like that's kind of like the comparison, I think, right? Like Fortnite, which is undoubtedly...
okay, that's actually super fair, right? Like Infinity War is not going to get Movie of the Year, but like Black Panther might, or something kind of along those lines. And so, you know, in the same way that like last year we had Get Out, right, which was in the Best Picture contenders, but you know, Wonder Woman or whatever was kind of like disqualified. I actually kind of feel like that's pretty fair. As much as I don't understand or know Fortnite, because I've never even touched Fortnite, but I wouldn't want to be in a world where it's like, okay, well, whatever, you know, game makes it, you know, blasts onto the scene and becomes like the biggest flash in the pan game ever. I mean, last year would have been PUBG, right? You know, and I think that would have kind of been a mistake in a way.
Yeah, so this is weird because like I want to like make a point about like, you know, the games as art. Win at like the versus like the games as sport, but last year Overwatch won, and like Overwatch is definitely games as sport game.
Yeah.
Unless you consider the extended universe, that's a really weird like a weird kind of root effect.
Yeah, I mean that was kind of what we were getting at the other day in a way. It's kind of like saying that like, okay, I was thinking about this when it comes to like the NFL or the NHL or something like that, but like imagine if there was like a really complicated backstory to like the term Giants from the New York Giants. You know what I mean? Like there was like world building that went into that or something kind of along those lines. I feel like in conventional sports, all of those things are kind of just, you know, like they're kind of left by the wayside to a certain extent. And inside of the game itself, right? Like, you know, inside of the game itself, there is absolutely nothing. There's no lore to it. It is all literal just rules, right? I feel like that's like an interesting thing when you compare it to Overwatch or League of Legends or Hearthstone or something where like, you know, these things all have an intrinsic lore to them, right? It could be true that every Hearthstone card could be named, you know, common 123 and it has 4 health and 3 attack and it's a 3 cost card, or, you know, like whatever like the stats and the effects are or whatever. But no, it's called Piloted Shredder or it's called, you know, whatever it is.
See, this is interesting because like there is some of that, right? Like, you know, to put it in terms that like you might be more familiar with, like this is the same type of thing you see with like esports, right? Like, you know, like even his teacher calls him a Zion Spartan, right? Like like there are stories about individual players, right? Like there are stories of franchises. It's not equally applicable to all of them, right? Like the Yankees have a long and storied history, and like maybe like the I don't know what's like the Milwaukee Brewers don't, but like, so there's some of that. I see what you're getting at. It's definitely like of a different kind with Overwatch specifically.
I mean, Overwatch and League of Legends follow the same thing, right? Like they don't have a story. I mean, well, okay, so I would say that they have a story, but they don't have a plot, right? There isn't a forward moving. There aren't like plot points or beats or something. There's just like a setting and characters and an aesthetic, right? And even themes or whatever. But there is no, you know, moving from plot point A to plot point B in the same way that, like, for instance, in, you know, World of Warcraft, there's moving from plot point A to plot point B or something, right? Which is a game that contains esports of some variety, but, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm very mad that none of the esports things mentioned Hearthstone stuff. This is some bullshit. Frodan obviously should have been. I don't know. I don't even know if he counts as a host.
Yeah.
I'm just making this. I'm just making this all up.
Yeah, I mean the esports ones were kind of also rapid fired through. Like none of them like those were I think were announced during the pre-show. Like there were a handful of awards that were like Jeff Keighley just read them off and like no one accepted it or anything. The biggest esports one was like streamer of the year, or you know, I forget what the term they used, but it went to Ninja,
right?
yeah,
Content creator or whatever of the year.
Ninja.
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned. I don't think I knew any of the names on that list.
my
just because I don't follow like Fortnite. It would be really interesting to me, I think, if it would be really interesting to me if like the inception of Fortnite kind of broke the tie that I have to like the core modern mainstream gaming culture, because I don't play Fortnite and I'm still playing like World of Warcraft. I don't know. I've been seeing a lot of people talking about this kind of thing when it comes to WoW. We were just like, oh, I'm quitting after 10 years or something like that. I'm like, damn, like 10 years this guy's been playing the game. But like, yeah, I've been playing it for 15 years or whatever. And I just feel like a game like World of Warcraft is aging into a game for 30-year-olds rather than being a game for 16-year-olds when it was released,
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that. Other thing, maybe the last thing I want to bring out of Game Awards is there were a couple of announcements, and the one that I think has got the most hype around it is Outer Worlds by Obsidian. But the greatest part of it was that like the advertisement campaign was like from like the original creators of Fallout and the people behind New Vegas, right? And like this is just like a knife in like Todd Howard's heart, right? Like, and
yeah,
it was. It was obviously all put together way before Fallout 76 was this trash fire that it was, but it's just kind of like the confluence and everything is just like hilarious.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of the, like I watched the Dragon Age 4 trailer, which I don't understand because I didn't finish all of the DLC in Dragon Age Inquisition. So I am now, you got me BioWare. I am now loading up Dragon Age Inquisition for a replay. So that I can understand who like the Dread Wolf Rises refers to.
See, I was hoping you would answer my question as to who that was.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's something. This happens actually a lot with the BioWare games, where the final DLC of a game will also be kind of like a tease or a tie-in to the next game. This happened with Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3. And the cool part about that was that like the tie-in was much more immediate. Mass Effect 2 comes out in 2010. Mass Effect 3 comes out in 2013. It has been 5 years since Dragon Age Inquisition came out. So I'm in need of a little bit of a refresher course, you guys.
Yeah, and like it was a nothing trailer, and according to like the sources that it the producer on the game was like, I've been like working on Anthem this entire time, and other people have been exploring stuff for Dragon Age 4, so like I'm pretty sure that's not coming out for another couple of years or so.
Jason Schreier confirmed they got rebooted last year, that they had done a bunch of work on it, but that they changed how they wanted to do things. Kind of, this was more implied. He didn't say this, but to me, that lines up very perfectly with Mass Effect Andromeda, which came out early last year, right? So, hypothetically speaking, they published Mass Effect Andromeda and then did a course correction, quote unquote, on Dragon Age 4. I would not be surprised to see or hear that. I also think it would be a little bit weird for BioWare to put out 2 games in a year, because obviously Anthem comes out this year.
Yeah. Are you excited for Anthem?
More of it. I am. BioWare has a lot of good faith from me. I even liked Mass Effect Andromeda, and hypothetically speaking, if they just pitched this game as it's Mass Effect Andromeda but an MMO, I would probably be down for it, because I thought like the combat controls and everything was so fun in Andromeda. So yes, I am hyped for Andromeda, or I'm sorry, I am hyped for Anthem from that perspective. I am not very enthusiastic to see. I just don't have a lot of time to play a lot of games, and we're going to see how it comes down. Obviously, Total War of the Three Kingdoms comes out next year. We're going to see more. I'm just going to keep playing World of Warcraft and Hearthstone probably, right? Like, these are games that are pretty well rooted into my daily existence. I'm even going back, we've been talking about CK2, but like Stellaris just came out with a new DLC that looks really cool, and I'm probably going to pull out the Mega Corpse DLC to play some Stellaris. So there's just like a lot of good stuff coming out this year, and so I don't want to say like, oh, I'm so super crazy hyped for Anthem, because if Anthem turns out to be the next Fallout 76, which I think is possible,
Yeah.
that could be trouble.
I agree. Yeah, I've also got it like that period, like this like February to like April is going to be crazy. There's what's the other games? There's Devil May Cry 5. There's Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. There's well, there's a couple others too, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But there's a lot coming out that I'm super excited for in that span.
I don't think Anthem comes out for a while though.
I thought it was February.
Does Anthem release? Oh, is it February?
I think that's what they
Holy
said.
shit! It's February 22nd.
Yeah.
For some reason, I thought it was coming out in. I thought it was coming out in September. I was like, oh, it's like a year away or whatever. Yeah. Wow. Boy. Fucking damn. February. I did. Yeah. So I have heard that there is going to be a like a demo or something like that. Let me actually take a look at this so I don't say something stupid. Okay, so there is going to be a demo in January. And there will be a demo in the first week of February, the first weekend in February. So yeah, so my big plan is to play the demo to see if I want to like actually kind of like buy into it. I also don't know that I would necessarily mind playing it kind of like I played Destiny 2 as like a single player game where I don't participate in much of that the end game content, you know, just to like run around being shooty guys or whatever, right? Like that's pretty fun. And you know, if there is enough content to get me to a 30-hour playtime, maybe, you know, I will probably feel pretty okay about that.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. Yeah. So, what else? Oh, the other thing that I can talk about this week is I played Smash. I played a bunch.
Oh yeah, Smush.
Smush, yes. I played some Smush yesterday. I haven't dug too deep into it. The first impressions, it's a Smash game. It's a good feeling Smash game. You know, I'm by no means an expert, but I've been going through the World of Light thing. It's neat. The spirits are neat, but like whatever. The only kind of like the only thing that I'm not a super huge fan of is that all the characters are locked, or almost all of them are locked initially, and I find that to be annoying more than anything else. And I would like to just play I would just like to be able to unlock my favorite character so I can play him online.
Who are your favorite characters?
So I play a lot of Ganondorf.
Okay.
I also play some Duck Hunt. But I also want to check out the Belmonts and Incineroar, because Incineroar seems like he'll be like my style of play. So I'm excited for that.
What is like Incineroar's kind of like thing?
He's like
that
a
makes him
grappler.
your style of play. Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. During his announcement, there were like some very clear allusions to Zangief. Like they announced him right after Ken, and like his neutral B is like a lariat, and he's like, you almost might say he's a red cyclone, which is like a direct reference to Zangief. I'm like, oh,
Gotcha.
Because you know I'm a big Zangief fan. So we only got a couple of minutes left, but did you want to say anything about your week?
I haven't really been doing all that much. I've been preparing for the new WoW patch, which comes out on Tuesday. And the interesting thing is that they're doing heritage armor for base races, and the Blood Elves and the Dwarves are getting the first set of heritage armor that comes out with 8.1. So I have been, and part of the requirements to get these heritage armors is to be level 120 and to be exalted with like your whatever, like your city faction, Ironforge or Silver Moon respectively, and I was not exalted with either of those. So I was basically spending a lot of the week running old dungeons on Cliffgrove, my dwarf, and Sarathan, my my blood elf, to rep up, because like basically the best way to rep up is to put on those tabards and do the old dungeons. But the problem is that they introduced something called trivial They like if you are more than 10 levels above the content, that content is then trivial. So you get reduced. You only get 20% of like the rep gains that you would normally get. So like every mob you kill would normally give you 15 points, but instead you only get 3. So I was just running these things over and over and over again. And that actually sounds awesome, but I gotta be honest, it was actually pretty fun just because I was getting a lot of transmog that I really thought was cool. And it was, you know, a nice, cheap, easy sort of break from the game while I'm watching like Twitch streams of the new Hearthstone decks. So there's that.
Yeah. Neat.
I'm very excited also because this coming week is going to bring the single player content for the new Hearthstone expansion, which is going to be like the dungeon runs from Kobolds and Catacombs or the Witchwood, but where you choose a class based on, do you know like any of the Rastikan's Rumble like lore sort of setup or anything like that?
I do not.
Yeah, so the idea with Rastikan's Rumble is that like every 20 years, once a generation, all of the trolls gather in the Gurubashi arena to like duke it out, and they like pledge themselves to like each of the different like Loa, right? And so in Hearthstone terms, this comes down to every class got a Loa and also got a champion of that Loa. So some of these are like famous trolls from lore, like Zul'jin is a hunter hero who is the champion of the Lynx Loa Halazi or whatever, and like Hexlord Malakras, who is I'm pretty sure a Zul'Gurub boss from like the original ZG, the level 60 raid ZG from Vanilla. He was like one of like these legendary cards or whatever. So I am very excited to dig into that and get back into sort of like the PvE side of things. So this has been a very good expansion for warriors in general. So I've been playing a lot of Hearthstone, just in general.
Yeah, excellent. But yeah, I think that's all the stuff we had time for. But you want to talk about? Okay, so we're good. If you want to get in touch with us and tell us what you think about Rastikan's Rebel or Smush or any of the other things we talked about on this podcast, like the campaign that we just pitched, you can reach us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. You can follow us on twitch.tv/somederpsplaygames. You haven't been on there in a while, but we're going to try and finish Hell's Rebels this month, right?
Yeah, we need people to respond to the thing.
Yeah.
But hypothetically speaking, we're trying really hard.
And then we don't have any plans, I think, for anything else, but we'll let you know on this podcast if you want to know. What else? You can rate us and review us on iTunes. You can like us. You can comment on SoundCloud where we normally are. You can these go up on YouTube, although I think I forgot to do the last one, so forgive me if that's the case, but that will be up soon. I think that's everything I had, but did you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else that I'm looking to promote.
In that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.